Hi everyone, this is Mike from EV Swap, and if this looks like a fun way to spend your Sunday afternoon crimping and wiring and connecting to batteries, then oh do I have a task for you. Today we're going to hook up an Orion BMS to a Chevy Volt battery. Okay, so I normally like to start my video with a list of the tools that you're going to need to complete the task. And I should say that today's task, what we're going to cover, is just wiring the cell taps between the Orion BMS and the batteries themselves. So the cell taps monitor the voltage of each individual cell and also drain off some so that they will charge up evenly. And that all happens right here. And this is where the cell taps plug into the Orion BMS. Now, this is a 108 cell unit. So there's three groups here. Each group has 36, so 36 times 3 is 108. And the Chevy Volt battery pack is 96 cells. So there's 44 here, I believe, and then the rest are here. So if you were going to wire these all together into one battery pack, which is the way that it came from Chevrolet, a 108 cell unit would be just fine. But I'm breaking mine up. So the large battery is going to go in the back seat of my car, and then the two small batteries will go in the front. That's just the way, that's going to work out better for the weight of my particular car. So what that means is that even though there are plenty of cell taps on a 108 cell unit, it actually will not work. I had to upgrade to the next one up that has 4 groups of 36. And a lot of these aren't going to be, a lot of the individual cell taps in each of these are not going to get used, so it kind of seems wasteful a little bit. But it's what's necessary in order to hook the BMS to the batteries properly. So there's really 3 things that I had to wrap my head around when it came to wiring the cell taps for an Orion BMS. And one of them is understanding why I had to use 132 cell unit rather than 108, which I'll explain in a minute. The next thing that's a little bit unusual is when you wire in these groups, everything's done in groups of 12, and they each have their own individual ground. And if there are any of the 12 that you don't use, you have to bridge them all together. So that's kind of strange. We'll explain that in a minute. And then the last thing is this idea that each group of 12, if you notice there are black wires for each group of 12, each group of 12 has its own negative, and that might actually make you have to add what might be best called a tap. And so I've got one here, I'll take the cover off in a minute, where we actually had to tap into here to kind of create a negative lead. So I'm going to cover all that in detail so that you'll understand why it took me a while to kind of understand those 3 components of setting up the BMS. And again, this is just going to be on the cell tap side. But once I wrapped my head around those 3 sort of oddities, the rest of it is pretty straightforward. So let's kind of cover why I had to go from 3 groups to 4 groups. Let's talk about that first. Okay, so let's talk about cell taps. So if we were to take the 3 battery packs, the 3 sub packs for the Chevy Volt, one has 44 cells, the next one has 28 cells, and then the last one has 24 cells for a total of 96 cells. Okay, if you were going to wire these all together in one giant pack that was all in the same battery box or all in the same location in your car, then it would be perfectly fine to use the 108 three group Orion BMS, because they're all wired together. As long as you don't put a fuse or an emergency disconnect in between these, which a lot of people do, because if you put an emergency disconnect inside of here, you can greatly reduce the voltage of the whole pack in case there's a problem. But if you don't put that in, then you can wire all these together. But the location of these fuses, that's actually really important to how you group the cells in the Orion BMS. So let me explain. So in my car, instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the largest cell pack with the 44 cells in the back of the car. And then in the front of the car, I'm going to put the 28 and the 24. Okay, and so let's assume that we're going to do the negative most, which is where you always start. Let's make this the negative most part of the battery pack. So what would happen is each of these groupings has 36 cell taps. So we would be able to run 36 cell taps here to cover 36 of the 44. And then the balance here would come out of the next group. And so that would be 8, right? 44 minus 36 is 8, if my math is right. Okay, so what that means is that we used 8 of the cell taps here in this group. But because it's a long run here between the back of the car and the front of the car, even if I didn't put a disconnect, which I think I am going to put a disconnect in between, but even if I didn't, just the fact that it's a long run between these two battery packs, it means that I cannot use any more of this group, the second group right here, even though there's 24 left, I cannot use them because when you have a disconnect, you can only use, or a fuse, or a long run, you can only place them between the groups here. Okay, they cannot occur in the middle of one of these runs of 36. And that's the first thing that I had to kind of wrap my head around. So that's the reason why I ended up having to go with 4 groups of cell taps. So the first 2 would be used here and here, and then the second 2 groups would be used here. So we'd be able to use 28 and then the remaining of the 36, so there'd be 8 left here. That would all be tied together onto one wire loom, and then the remaining 16 right here would be on another wire loom that would take up the 4th place. Okay, so and here's the reason why they explain why if you're going to have a long run or an emergency disconnect or a fuse, it has to occur here between these groups. And here's the reason why. So let's say that you had 2 batteries. Let's say that you had this configuration up here just with 2 cells, the 28 and the 24. And let's say that you had some sort of a fuse right here between them, okay? 28 and the 24. And let's say you wired them so that all 36 of the first group covered it like this. So this is your first cell tap group, and it covered the 28 cells here plus an additional 8 cells over here. And if this fuse blew, then you would have a high voltage connection between the 28th cell here and the next cell over here, but the high voltage would be passing through the wire loom. And the BMS is not designed it can't protect itself from that high voltage coming through on a group anywhere from here to here. However, there are protections built in case there's a disconnect here or here that can handle the high voltage. So that's why whenever you have a fuse, a long run, or emergency disconnect, they have to occur here between these groups. Okay, so that's the first thing that you have to get comfortable with when you're kind of planning your battery and what size BMS. And that's the reason why 108 cell, 3 group BMS was not going to be enough for me, so I ended up having to buy a larger one with 4 groups on it. And that's just because even though 96 cells, that's just the way it all laid out in this particular case. So you got to kind of do that math first. Now there is a calculator on their website, and basically you put in your battery pack configuration where you're going to have disconnects and long runs, and it'll basically map this out for you. And this is really a great tool. This is what I ended up using. So as you can see, 1, 2, 3, 4, it's going to require 4 connectors for me. And so you can see the first battery pack runs 1 through 36 and then goes to 44 right here, then stops. And then the rest of these are not used whatsoever. So the remaining cell taps within this group, a vast majority of them are not used. And kind of the same thing here. So the next cell group, we use all 36 going across here, and then we end up only using about 2/3 of them, or maybe even less than that, I think it's the first 16 of the cell taps, and the remaining ones don't get used over here as well. But that's just how the Orion BMS works, and you have to be conscious of where you put brakes and when you're designing that, okay? And don't figure that out before you order your BMS, or you'll end up with 2 of them like me. Okay, so next we're going to talk about the groups of 12. Okay, so groups of 12, this is what we mean. So this is the Orion cell tap wire loom. And as you can see, there's 3 groups of 12, different color code for each group. And then also there's a black negative lead for each group of 12. All right, so the second thing that you kind of got to get used to is that when you partially use a group of 12, you have to tie off the remaining leads together to the very last one. And they even kind of tell you that. So we're dealing with this last connector right here. And if you notice, this first group of 12, which runs from here all the way to here, those are all used with individual leads, and that's fine. And then we kind of roll around here to our negative 13, then our 13th lead. We go to 94, 93, 94, 95, 96. Okay, so that's the last cell of a Chevy Volt pack, right? It's cell number 96. But if you notice, we still have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 more leads here within the second group of 12. First group of 12, second group, third group. So when you have a partially used group of 12, what they're telling you here is that you have to tie together all these remaining leads. So starting with the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, those all have to be bundled together. And so what that looks like, the way I accomplished it here is I used one of these are kind of a cool joining screw-in kind of device. But so I don't want to take this all apart, but if you look, there are basically 9 leads coming out of the wire loom right here. And there's number 16, and there's 18, and there's 17, right? So it's all the ones that we talked about here. They all go together into this one single lead that then runs down into the battery pack at this position right here at position number 16. So what you're doing is you're tying together all of these leads to use the remaining of the group of 12. And you always have to do that. Now the final group of 12 here, if you notice, they're marked with NA because we're just not using them. It's not necessary because we're finished, right? We have all 96 cells covered with taps. So when you have a group that's completely not used and there's really nothing you have to do with it, I guess I'll just cut it off short and make sure the ends are sealed off, but they don't have to be tied together. It's just the ones that are unused within the group of 12. So that's kind of the next thing that you got to get used to when wiring these, is you have to have a way to bridge them together. And this particular connector that I have, these pieces just screw in. It really works quite well because you can see it's made for a bunch of leads on one side to come together, and I just have 2 leads coming out on the other side, but really you would normally just have 1 coming out the other side. Okay, so that's groups of 12. Okay, so here is the last thing that it took me a while to understand, and that is the necessity for this cell tap right here. So let me explain. These batteries are all going to be wired together, and for the wire loom that connects these, it's actually super simple because we have 12 cells, and then 12 cells. And that's exactly how the Orion BMS is designed. So it's really just a one-to-one wiring. You'll see there's exactly 12 leads in here plus the negative, 12 leads here plus the negative, and then on this one, 12 leads here plus the negative. So wiring these 3 groups of 12 is very natural. But then something kind of strange happens here. So this is a row of 16, and this is what we're addressing here in the last connector group. So if you notice, I guess it's okay to put paper on here. So if you notice that this last group, we're going to do a full set of 12, and then and then we're going to kind of start over, and we're going to use just the remaining 3 or 4 cells here in this group, and we tie them together as we just sort of talked about. But the one thing that's a little bit tricky here is the minus that you see right here, right? So the minus 13. So if we start here, here's our ground, and that's what it's asking you for right here. That's the ground. And then we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, right? And it's really nice. If you look carefully, they're labeled. Like, see where it says CV12, CV11. So Chevy does a really nice job of labeling these. And then after that, then we have 13, 14, and 15. And so that would be 13, 14, and 15. But the question is, well, so where do we get minus 13 from? Because there's not a minus 13 cell. Well, minus 13 is the negative for this next run of 12. And then on another run, you would also have a minus 25 as well. But so we have minus 13. The question is, where do you wire it? Well, from an electrical standpoint, from a potential difference standpoint, minus 13 and 12 are the exact same thing. So when you start at 13, if you want to get to minus 13, you would just back up 1, and lo and behold, there you are with 12. So you have 2 options. You could tie together the minus 13 lead, which is going to be that black lead in the last group, or the second group. You could tie that together with number 12, and from a voltage standpoint, it would be correct. However, I spoke to the people at Orion, and they said what we prefer you do is actually put a cell tap here on number 12, and then we'll call that minus 13. And so, and it seems like they would be the same thing, but it actually does make a difference in the voltages. So it only happens a couple places, and when I was building my pack out and the way it's kind of oriented, I only had to do it a couple times. And so I just drilled a hole in there, and then that's a 4mm bolt, and put it in place. But what that allows me to do is, on our wiring harness, it allows me to have a lead. So the first group, I think, is going to be the orange. So the orange would run from here, from here all the way up to 12, and then it would allow me to have a lead for this next one in the red group, the black, the ground for the red group. Actually have a lead to tie it to. And even though minus 13 is exactly the same as 12, this way I have a single lead for it that gets tied into the loom correctly. So I hope that makes sense. When you need a minus 13 or a minus 25, unless you just got lucky and it happened to be where there was a break in the pack, and there was a minus lead for you. So that's what this guy is right here. They have it marked as CV00, so that would just be the negative lead. But when you have a run of 16 like we do here, you don't get a negative 13, so you have to build your own by putting a tap in at 12. So I hope that makes a little bit of sense. That was the last thing that kind of freaked me out a little bit, and how to wire these. All right, so let's talk about the pinouts and how you connect the wiring that came with the Chevy Volt battery to the wiring that came with the Orion BMS. So I'm just going to use this battery as an example because, boy, this is the easiest of all of them to do because it's in natural groups of 12. So we have 12 cells here, 12 cells here, and over here, 12 cells. So I just wired them all together as 36, and that's exactly how the Orion BMS likes to operate because each of these groups are three groups of 12 for 36 in this connector. So it works out really well, and we also have natural negatives for each of the 3 groups of 12 here on the battery pack, so we don't have to do anything tricky like add the tap that we did in this next run over here. All right, so you got to kind of figure out which pin goes to which one, and so fortunately Chevy made it really straightforward. The ground is in the upper left-hand corner, So that's the, here I have a little diagram here as well. So the ground is in the upper left-hand corner, and then you start 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so you'll see the voltages climb up. If I can do this one-handed. So there's the first cell at 3.8, and then we go to number 2, and there we are at 7.6, then we go to number 3, and we get to 11.4. So you get the idea. They just kind of march in sequence, just like I have on this piece of paper. And then there are 5 unused portions of this. Because this is a 12-cell run that we have here, there are going to be 13 pins, 1 negative, and then 12 positives. So you can measure them. I guess what I was saying, what's nice is that it's exactly the same on all of these batteries. The ground is always the upper left-hand corner, and then the progression always marches the same way. Now, another thing you can do, if you'd like, is if you take the cover off of the battery, you can see the pins, of course, and then you can actually see them run. Like there it goes to CV0, and here it goes to CV1. It's like a little printed circuit board. So you can also sort of follow it that way if you want to. And then, so Chevy Volt batteries are always groups of 12 or groups of 16, which makes it really simple. So this is a group of 12 over here, and this is a group of 16. So you'll see there are a few more pins occupied in this connector. So there are a total of 17 pins, ground in the upper left-hand corner, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it's really straightforward. The next thing that you have to do is, what I did was I would write out the pin positions here, and then next I would write in the numbers that are associated on the wiring loom. And when you do the first one, it's really simple because it's just 1 to 1. So you have the black going to negative, and then you have cable number 1 going to number 1, number 2. But when you do the next group, then you have the negative is going to be minus 13, and then the 1 pin right here would be lead number 13, and then lead number 14, then lead number 15. So I always would draw little maps as I wired them. The other thing that I would do is, so this is the lead that came out of the Chevy Volt pack. The cover here comes off. If you notice, there's a tab right there, and then there's 2 tabs on the back side as well there, and 1 more there. So you can pop that cover off, and it makes it really easy to follow the wires and then take them. I chose to crimp these. I don't know if I'm going to stick with that. And then over here, of course, you've got the individual labels that Orion puts on the wiring loom, which is really nice. So, you do have to make the connections. So there's 13 connections in here, and like I said, I crimped them. But this is just for the test bench. This is so I can get everything wired up and operating here before I put it in the car. But that's basically how you figure out, what pin here in these connectors goes to what labeled cable on the Orion BMS. Okay, so you have your wire loom all put together. You have merged the Chevy Volt connectors with the Orion BMS loom, and now you need to test it. So you could test it with a voltmeter, which would be very tedious and be easy to make a mistake. Basically, every 3.8 volts approximately, march up in order all the way through all 36 pins plus the grounds on this loom. Or you could get one of these nifty devices. So this is a cell tap wiring tester, and you can actually rent these from Orion. You can rent them by the week. And so you just plug in the wire loom there and turn it on. It boots up, and then you press this button right here for it to begin the test. So if you notice, bank 1 is good, bank 2 is good, but bank 3 has an error, and which I was kind of surprised to see because it was all good before I turned the camera on, of course. And then you press the button, you can scroll through. So this is bank 1. This is bank 2, and this is bank 3. And you can see there's definitely something it doesn't like. And then if you go through, again, it'll show you the voltages. So this is what we sort of talked about, 3.7 volts on the first pin, and then 7.4 on the next, 11.3 on the next. You get the idea, kind of marching through about 3.5 volts each. So we go to bank 2, and they keep going up. And notice that number 24 is at 90.9 volts. And then we press it again, and lo and behold, we're at 0 volts for all these banks. So after I look at this, I kind of realized the mistake I made is these batteries are not tied together. So see, there's no lead going from the positive here to the negative there. And I suspect that's what the problem is. So let me put the camera down, connect the batteries like they should be, and then we'll see what it says. Okay, so now we have a lead going from this battery to this battery like it will be in the battery pack. And I'm just using Chevy Volt wiring. And so let's see if that makes the tester more happy. So we will turn it on. It boots up. We will press the button. And there we go. Good, good, and good. So that's what you want to see. And I would encourage you to rent one of these when you're finished just to make sure everything's okay, because it did catch a mistake that I made over here in this big bundled mess. And it makes it really clear exactly which lead is bad. So I had a bad crimp. So anyway, that's how you test it. Holy cow. So if you are still watching this video, then you have made it to 27 minutes, which is way longer than I ever hoped or wanted this video to be. But I searched the web for months when I was trying to figure out how to wire these batteries properly. And while there are a couple of videos out there, none of them really go into any depth into actually how to do the pinouts and how to deal with breaks and the batteries and the groupings and everything we talked about. So I hope that if you are facing such a wiring job, that after watching this video that's going to be pushing 30 minutes, I hope that you can do it now on your own. I hope you've got the information that you need, and that's really what I'm trying to accomplish. I always like to talk about the tools that I have, so I would recommend for all those crimps you're going to have to do, there's going to be almost 100 of them, getting a really high quality crimping tool. Got this from Amazon. You're also going to need a really good wire stripper, so this thing's super cool, just one-handed. It'll just pop the sheath right off of the wire. That's nice. And then we demonstrated too the testing tool, which you can rent from eWort. eWort Energy, I think, which is the company that makes Orion BMS. So I recommend renting one of these as well. Special thanks to my friend Tony. Tony is doing a very similar project to what you see me doing here. He lives over in Brandon, not too far from here. And he came over about a week and a half ago and helped me put together the first wiring loom, and it was a big help, and I could not have done it without him. So Tony, thank you very much. And finally, what we're going to do in the next video, which hopefully won't be 30 minutes long, is we'll deal with the other part of the wiring. So we got the cell taps in place, but the next thing to do is to hook up the BMS to the charger and to the inverter and to a 12-volt power source and a couple other things so that it can do its real job besides managing the batteries, and that is also controlling the rest of the drivetrain, telling it when it can operate and when it should shut itself down because there's a problem. So we'll cover that next time. Thanks for watching. Sorry it was so long.